I met Dr. Hilarie Cash in April when she came to our first Screen Time Action Network conference, and I could tell immediately that she had a compassion, a keen sense of human development that she brought to this precarious work of young people who get addicted to video games and the internet. Just a topic that not most of us want to mention. We don't even want to say the word addiction. And she's co-founder and chief clinical officer at Restart Life, which is a residential treatment center for internet and gaming addiction. Welcome, Hilarie. And Cris Rowan is an occupational therapist and founder of Zonin Programs and Moving to Learn. She travels to schools throughout Canada and she speaks internationally, and Cris is a force to be reckoned with. Cris has so much great information, but her work with children is connecting brain activity with physical activity. And while we can all say that we think we know about that and it makes sense to us, Cris has the information that can really help parents and kids to change their behavior and disrupt that progression to screen addiction. And so we brought Cris and Hilarie together today to provide the long view. Most of us, when we talk about screen time, we can talk about it in early childhood and the kids who we see swiping on their devices, and then we talk about it with regards to social media and gaming when kids are older, but we don't often think about the connections between the two. So I think we're really very lucky to have Hilarie and Cris with us today to sit back and really listen to the discussion, formulate your questions, and I think you'll find this an intriguing discussion. So Hilarie, I'd like to start with you. We see a range of behaviors. We all have seen a range of behaviors. Whether you're here as a parent or you're here as a professional or an educator, we've seen a range of behaviors with kids and their gaming and their internet use. So how do kids get addicted in the first place? Can you give us an idea of a place to start? How do we identify that?
Well, kids get involved at various times in their childhoods. And what I think it might be useful for me to give you a couple of case studies, one of which is of a young man who came to our adolescent program when he was 15. Now, he's a young fellow who had been introduced to gaming at the age of 4 because he had a very tech-savvy household. He had an uncle who did coding and really introduced him to coding in elementary school in his really very young years. So he'd been involved heavily with tech ever since a very early age. And by the time he was 12 or so, he had started doing much more than coding and playing video games. By the age of 12, he was starting to troll. It was a favorite activity of his online. And for those of you who might not be familiar with the word, it means, it refers to somebody who likes to create upset and disruption online through what they are saying. And so he would go to various sites, not just gaming sites, but other sites as well, and create an upset by what he said and then disappear. And this to him was great fun. So these are some of the things. He'd been introduced to porn. He'd found porn by the time he was 8. So all of these were activities that he was engaging in more and more and more. And by the time he came to us, because he had, in the year before he came to us, he had threatened his parents with a knife because they had taken away the computer, and they'd taken away the computer because he had figured out a way to actually block his parents from going online. He'd worked around their firewalls, their efforts to monitor and protect him. And so the police had been called, and then he reached a point where he was threatening suicide because of parents' attempts, their restrictions. And he ended up in the hospital, and from there he was referred to us. So that gives you an idea of kind of how this can progress. The other is a young man, a 25-year-old, who came to our adult program, and he hadn't been introduced to video games or anything online until he was 8. But from there, and throughout his elementary years, his gaming was within normal limits, and it was not really a big deal interfering with his life. But once he got to high school, he was being bullied somewhat throughout his schooling experience, and just more and more the gaming was taking over his life. He was also spending a great deal of time with pornography, and he managed still to graduate with decent grades so that he got into college. But once he was in college, his entire life became preoccupied with gaming, with his online activities, with pornography. And so he failed out of college. He tried working. He was not very successful at work because the only thing that interested him, that he was willing to spend time with, were the video games. And he also became suicidally depressed, and his parents, very, very worried about him, found us and sent him to us. So that just gives you some idea of how this can go from something that seems fairly benign to something that can be quite extreme.
Well, Hilarie, I know probably like some of our viewers today, when you said 4-year-old, I just sucked my breath in. You know, we don't really think about it starting that young, I don't think, even though we see kids on screens, we don't think about the trajectory starting that young. And that's certainly a very sad story. And then on the other end, when we think about kids, you know, parents paying tuition and trusting that their child's doing well in college, and knowing that that's going on instead, and that has eclipsed really the experience that we expect kids to have in college, is also incredibly sad. I'm going to share a story with you of my own experience and see what you think about this scenario to add to the two that you just gave us. So my stepson, Ben, I came into his life when he was 10 years old. And it's a time where, you know, you can't really step into the parenting necessarily comfortably that's already happened. And Ben was playing excessive video games in middle school, and I would just see him sitting for hours on Minecraft and Assassin's Creed in his case. And he was spending hours and hours, and I was really freaking out. You can imagine what I do for a living here at the Children's Screen Time Action Network was not, and I wasn't here then, I was doing parenting workshops on the topic. I was freaking out. And Ben today is the least plugged in of our 5 children. He's in college now. He plays the string bass. He's a poet. He is a hiker. He's an avid hiker. He's hiked many, many peaks, and is very proud and feels confident about his physical health. He also is very social. He's the least plugged in of all of our kids, and I was panicking. So tell me, Hilarie, how does a parent decide this is the time I should be freaking out, or this is, my child's going to be okay, this is just average video game playing that a 10-year-old or a middle schooler would be doing?
Well, this would be a good time to look at the ICD-11 definition of gaming disorder. And so if we can see that slide, not this one, but that one, yes. And so if you have a look at that, it is pretty general, and it explains that the criteria for this gaming disorder has, as you can see, impaired control, and then the gaming taking over life more and more over time, and a continuation and escalation of it to the point where there are negative consequences. So as a parent, you have to really evaluate how difficult a child's life is likely to be if they continue on that same trajectory. And is it escalating? I mean, this is actually one of the really common things about addiction, is that it doesn't hold steady. It tends to increase, and not just gaming, but other activities online start taking over more and more. And certainly there are those kids who are going to dive deep into gaming and then come out of it. But there are those who are going to dive deep into gaming and just keep going down and down. And so it is really, I think, up to parents to figure out how it is that they are going to be able to intervene if they see this happening in their 10 or 12-year-old, and try to get their lives built out in a whole wide variety of ways, so that there are more things that the child will be interested in and have some skills in, besides the gaming and the other online activities. And I think it is useful here when a parent is really thinking about, oh my gosh, I'm looking at my kid and how my kid is behaving and what my kid is doing online, and I'm really worried. And I think this is where it would be great to turn it over to Cris to talk about the red flags that parents can start looking for as they're trying to figure out how serious a problem it is that they're dealing with.
Perfect. Hilarie, thank you for explaining that progressive nature to us. And I would love to turn it over to Cris now, because Cris, we don't normally think about the progression when we're seeing those kids swiping on the iPads or the little ones with the phones. We might think it's cute. We might even be horrified of it, but we're not thinking about the progression. So can you tell us about what are those signs that parents should be looking for? What are the red flags?
Well, I just want to first, I'm sure everyone is quite familiar with the American Academy of Pediatrics guidelines, but I just want to quickly review those, because there's 3 areas parents can intervene in managing their child's screen use, and that's in duration, content, what they're watching, and the age of first entry into screens. All 3 of those really impact on whether or not your child's going to have a problem. So the AAP says for the 0 to 2s, nothing, the 3 to 5s, no more than an hour a day, and over 6 and up, no more than 2 hours a day. So right away there, if you have a child who's using 10 hours a day, likely you're going to see problems. Now, all children are different, and there's differential susceptibility to all this media content, but really try to adhere to what the pediatric guidelines are telling us. So the red flags that you're seeing are a compilation of what the research is telling us, but also what I see when I work with children, and use becomes problematic, right? So there's nothing wrong with kids using screens and using screens within the guidelines, but when we start seeing problematic use, then we really want to be concerned, right? So with parents, there's often a gut feeling they have, my kid's not okay. With my own son, I got that feeling really strongly when he was 12, that he was overusing, and he was. And, you know, it was just kind of like, I was thinking, I want my son back. I can really get choked up when I talk about this, but I was losing my son to the screens, literally. And I had to do something immediately to get my son back. So these red flags are what we see is developmental delays, largely due to the sedentary nature. When kids spend a lot of time sitting around, they are not exercising, their fitness levels are low. We see delays in fine motor, gross motor. We see delays in speech, delays in cognition. So if your teacher in particular, or daycare preschool supervisor, is telling you that your child is delayed in any way, that's a red flag. Sleep. sleep deprivation, sleep, nightmares, not being able to go to sleep, poor sustained sleep. So they go to sleep, but then they wake up frequently. Those are all signs, again, that the child might be overusing, might have problematic use, using, like the pediatricians tell us, they shouldn't be using for at least an hour before they go to bed, because it wakes up the part of the brain that needs to go to sleep. Social phobias, so they're saying, I don't want to go over to Joey's house, or why do we always have to go over and visit grandma? So they're feeling more comfortable at home. Even some kids I work with, don't want to come to school, right? So they're phobic of social situations in schools. Behavior issues, get really controlling. When kids overuse devices, the device is actually super easy to control. It's very entertaining, and it, the content that they're watching really kind of, you become what you watch in some ways, right? So when we're seeing this defiant behavior, no, I don't want to do that, or make me, these kind of things, or wanting to really be in control of their lives, that's an issue. Self-regulation issues, so they're tantruming, they can't wait their turn, they don't understand turn taking. Disinterest in activities. This is a really big one. Your child should have at least 5 other things. When you say, hey, turn that off, you've had enough screen time, they should transition into an alternate activity that's more healthy, right? So they might pick up a book, they might go outside and play, they might, call a friend. So we want to see them doing, having a huge array of alternate activities that they can turn to. Dependency, so they're pathetically dependent, help me, I can't do this, they're anything that challenges them, they cave with. Emotional issues, so depression, anxiety, there's a lot of research now showing that those are directly linked to screen overuse. Attention deficit, that stuff goes so fast that they get into school and they're just like, the teacher is boring and school is boring. Of course it is, because screens are so entertaining now, right? So we're seeing that they're very distracted and hypervigilant to auditory and visual stimuli. And they have learning, obviously they have difficulty learning. If we can't pay attention, we can't learn, right? And performance. So their grades are starting to drop, they're saying, I don't want to go to school, I want to drop out. Those are kind of the red flags. So we really want to know those and be able to kind of cha-ching, add them up a bit and say, oh gosh, my kid really does have a problem or not. I just wanted to talk about one more thing is when we're growing a child, it's kind of like building a house. And so if you can move to the slide, building foundations. And so there's 4 components that are really critical that children need lots and lots of when they're very, very young. And those are movement, touch, human connection, and nature. So when we have our little infants and our toddlers and our children, they need lots and lots and lots of that bottom rung there. So that becomes the foundation. And if they don't get enough or a good quality of those components, then we're going to see problems as you move up the hierarchy there. We're going to see problems with coordination and strength and self-regulation and feeling really secure, being able to calm and focus, attend and learn and develop and be sustainable. So the ways in which we're raising kids with screens grossly limit access to those 4 critical components.
Jean, if we could go back to the red flags for a moment, I'd like to just explain to people what we're seeing in the adults that we're working with. So these are people who are 18 to 28 years old. And just to go quickly through them, the delayed development, what we're seeing in particular is that so many of the young men who come in, and it's almost all men who come to Restart, even though we accept women, but very few women come, they are, especially physically, it is very noticeable. They are usually underweight or overweight. They are often very physically, they've never developed well in their physical and motor coordination. And so when they're doing fitness with us, which we have a pretty rigorous fitness program, they are often really struggling with their coordination and struggling to build just physical strength as they go. And many of them really make huge strides in that, but they're starting off struggling. They all come to us sleep deprived, and we've had one case in which there was a man who was 26 years old who could not sleep through the night. He was so sleep deprived that he had hallucinations while he was awake. And he'd been to multiple sleep disorder, investigated this with doctors for years. And no one had bothered no one had figured out that the problem was his video gaming, which he did all the time, and it had so disrupted his sleep over the years. After 6 weeks of being without screens, he actually started to sleep, and he's now doing very, very well. Social phobias. The folks who come to us their only social contacts very often are online, and in face-to-face interactions, they are very avoidant. They're very uncomfortable. Their social skills are poor, and their social confidence is lacking. And so they avoid social situations. And this shows up as a personality disorder or traits, what are considered traits of avoidant personality disorder. Their behavioral problems, defiant, oppositional, sometimes we see this more in the adolescents than we see it in the adults, fortunately. They seem to kind of grow out of it. The self-regulation, definitely, our guys are used to just turning to something online, video games or something else, in order to handle whatever difficult emotions they're experiencing. So we teach them, we do cognitive restructuring, where teach them to think in more positive and helpful ways. And we teach them mindfulness so that they can learn to self-regulate. They often have very few other interests, and some of them have never developed any other interests besides gaming or their online activities. And I can no longer see the checklist, so I can't keep going through it. But what I can tell you, the one other thing I can mention and would like to mention is dependency. That, again, as a personality disorder, there is a dependent personality disorder, and our folks do tend to show up with that as either a full-blown personality disorder or as showing traits of that. Emotional problems, they all come to us depressed, often suicidally depressed. They're all anxious, severely anxious. Most of them, 90% of them, have been diagnosed with attention deficit disorder. And this is a really tricky area because they are, if they don't have a genetic, true attention deficit disorder, and they're being put on, but what they have is a brain that's wired to and looks like it has an attention deficit disorder, and so they get diagnosed with that and they get put on Ritalin or something like that. It may be exactly the wrong way to approach this, because then they're very vulnerable to becoming addicted to speed, essentially. So this whole question about what is the correct diagnosis is a really huge question. And then, of course, I've already said how school performance, for the adolescents, they are simply refusing to go to school for the most part. For the adults, they've all failed out of college for the most part. So we can move on.
That was so helpful, Hilarie, to make those connections between what Cris is seeing and saying about younger children and what you're seeing in the young men mostly that are coming to you for help and recovery. I thought it was very telling, Cris, that you mentioned you are what you, so the you are what you eat kind of metaphor with, you said you are what you watch, thank you, or play or experience online. And whereas parents would at one point know where their kids were going physically to visit friends or to socialize, whether it would be bowling or youth group or whatever it was in other generations, we don't always know where they're going. And even if we know the video game, then as Hilarie is saying, they go other places, or they end up other places, or they end up with the trolling. That was a very helpful explanation too, Hilarie. I'd never really understood what that was. So that was very helpful. And I think the losing my son is also extremely painful. And I'm sure some of our viewers have either had the experience or experienced it with their students or patients, or where we're hearing it a lot now is with Fortnite. So I was wondering if either one of you wanted to comment on Fortnite or other games that you're seeing to be the most popular now, or the most harmful, or what you think might be the most harmful.
Well, I'll jump in just to say that when we opened Restart 10 years ago, the most popular game that all of our clients were playing when they came in, or most of them, was World of Warcraft. And then as time went by, it became League of Legends. And now, and then Counter-Strike has always been in there as a very, very popular game. And now it's Fortnite. The adolescents, every single adolescent who has been in our program has been a Fortnite player. It's been their favorite game. It's the one where they invest the most time. And now we're seeing that the younger adults, the 18 and 19-year-olds who are coming into our adult program, are also Fortnite players.
So jumping into our little wee ones, this is a very popular game in grade 1 and 2.
Fortnite, Cris?
Fortnite.
It's popular in grade 1.
And when I go in and I do my tech talks in the classroom, you know, I'll just ask the kids, I'll say, well, who's playing Fortnite? And all the little boys' hands go up, right? So I want to talk a little bit about what are we going to do, right? With and one more little piece to understand for clinicians, parents, and teachers, anybody who's viewing, is we really have to have a bit of knowledge around brain development. How does the brain develop at different stages? And so when a child's born, they're born with their full complement of neurons. So if we think of looking at a brain like looking at a road map, right? All the roads are there. And if we can have that slide on brains, the brains. So all the roads are there, and when a child develops, there's two processes that happen. So one is pruning of those neurons, and these processes happen relevant to the exposure of the environment, right? So when I said you are what you watch, or you know what you watch is who you become, this is very depicted best by looking at brain development, right? So what we are exposed to really is kind of how the brain gets wired. So here's this little infant that's got all the neurons in place, and this pruning process starts happening, right? So what the brain does in order to become really efficient is that it'll prune neurons that are not being used. And so over the course of the child's life, you know, let's say they live till they're 80, 2/3 of those roads or those neurons are going to be pruned. And the ones that get pruned are the ones that are not being used, right? Because the brain kind of goes, oh, we don't use those, you know, tracks to the frontal lobe, so we'll just cut those off, right? So the second process that happens in brain development is proliferation. So little roads get formed between neurons. And those little connector roads, again, are formed based on what the exposure of the child what type of stimuli they're being exposed to in an environment. So if we look at this slide, what we're seeing is that age 5, the green is actually the plastic part of the brain. So that's the brain that's, you know, still forming, there's pruning still happening and proliferation still happening. And if you move up to the middle brain, we can see by age 12, half of the brain is left green, but half the brain is blue, which is hardwired. So that's a brain that's not going to change a heck of a lot, right? And if we keep going up, what we'll see at age 20, it's almost fully hardwired, and by 25, you know, it's fairly hardwired, right? So early intervention is key. This process happens really rapidly, 0 to 2 years of age. Starts, you know, slowing down a tad, 3 to 5, you know, 6 to 12. By 12, you know, about half of this process is done, right? So I'm really keen to do our early interventions, right? Because there's so much that we can do at this age. And so what we really want is we want to give them lots of those 4 critical factors, lots of movement, touch, human connection, nature, and very little screens early on. And as they age, then the brain is becoming wired to be one that can pay attention, that can learn, that can socialize, that can do well and become, you know, an adult who doesn't come to Hilarie's place of work.
Absolutely. Cris, that was such a helpful explanation to walk us through the brain development like that and the pruning of the neurons. And I think that I would like to know what you suggest to parents who might not be able to get their kids outside or might not have that kind of outdoor environment. And also, how can our schools help? I mean, that now we know that kids are on screens during the day at school, and I know in our area recess is being eliminated or reduced, and I've heard of teachers sneaking their kids outside for some outdoor time and that kind of exposure to nature that you're talking about. On the other end of that spectrum are nature schools that we hear about. So what in there can you actually point us to for those solutions so that we can do the prevention before we have to do that intervention that Hilarie does?
So it's really important. I've developed a concept term, balanced technology management. So whether we're in homes, schools, or community settings, what we really want to start looking toward is balancing screens with healthy activities. I've been in this field for 25 years now, and I used to push screen reduction, and it just was never well accepted no matter who I was talking to, right? And so I developed this concept, balanced technology management. So what we want to focus on first is we want to focus on increased access to those 4 critical factors: movement, touch, human connection, and nature. And as we increase the access to healthy activities, right, screen use is automatically going to go down. And once people start feeling better, they're moving more, they're, you know, more excited about life, they're, you know, connecting with other humans, they're feeling mentally more competent and relaxed, then they have kind of more energy to really focus on screen reduction and creating some schedules and that sort of thing. So focus first on, I have a 10-step plan to move toward balanced technology management, which I've sent to Hilarie, and she's going to make available to the participants. But, you know, first, get informed. Here you are, you're listening to Hilarie and I. That's awesome. I honor you for that. Second, unplug yourself and make yourself available to your kids, whether you're a teacher, whether you're a counselor, whether you're, you know, don't be answering and picking up that phone every 2 or 3 seconds. I mean, it's so difficult. Kids need that human connection, and they know when they're being tossed aside in preference to a phone, no matter who it is, right? So you want to disengage or disconnect yourself first and make yourself available to your kids. Create some sacred time around when there is no screens. So dinner, I always say an hour a day, day a week a year, completely disconnect as a family, as a classroom, you know, as—
Can you say that again? Can you slow down and say that again?
Day a week a year. Yeah. So an hour a day, carve out around a meal. I mean, that's usually what I suggest, that you can come together as a family, no screens. They all get put in a basket or somewhere where you can't hear them vibrating and talking to you. And you actually sit down as a family and have a conversation. Like this is one of the most sacred places is the dining room table. In the car is another place, you know, where we don't get a lot of time to talk to our kids, right? So we really have to, you know, make some rules around, okay, nothing around the dinner table. So the day a week, generally Saturday is busy with sports and, you know, shopping or whatever. So Sunday, can you do a no screen day? And if you can't, as a family, do a 24-hour unplug, then again, that's another big red flag, right? So when I work in schools, I give them the 24-hour unplug challenge. Your mission, should you choose to accept it, is to go 24 hours without screens. 3 o'clock today, 3 o'clock till 3 o'clock tomorrow. And then I go back in the classroom in the morning and hear the stories, you know, about how successful they were. Usually about half of them can do that, right? And so if you can't, again, that just means there's a little more of an issue. It's a bigger problem maybe than you thought, right? And then the week a year is the family holiday. Try at least once a year to reset those kids' brains, reset your family relationships, and go, you know, a whole family vacation without screens. I do it. It's marvelous. It's marvelous.
That sounds amazing. That sounds really great, Cris. And those early interventions, those early preventative measures that we can take that you're talking about, so important for us to hear over and over again. We have lots of them on, and the resources from this webinar will be on the Children's Screen Time Action Network resource library at screentimenetwork.org. I just want to make sure that I mentioned to say that, but so important. Hilarie, I'd like to go back to you for a moment and ask you, sometimes parents will come to us, I'm sure they do to you too, Cris, and say, oh, I have a 15-year-old, it's too late. Or they might say, I have a 6-year-old, but it's too late for my 15-year-old. I can start doing this now with the 6-year-old. Is it ever too late, Hilarie? And what would you tell those parents who think it might be too late?
Well, it's absolutely never too late. And it's really amazing and gratifying, I have to say, to see how far the adults can change, you know, because we, you know, when you think back to the screens about the brain development and, you know, up to age 20, and it's sort of, there's that feeling of, oh my gosh, you know, everything is set, but it's really not. The brain is still very malleable. And so even with the adults, when they are taken away from screens and they're away from screens in our program for 2 months minimum, and you know, they're getting physically healthy, catching up on sleep, doing all the healthy things and socializing together with people who get them and understand, and they can enjoy one another. I mean, these guys really start to develop in wonderful ways. So it's just absolutely never too late. I think the earlier you intervene, obviously it's going to be easier. By the time a kid is 14, 15, 16, they're viewing their parents less and less as authority figures to, you know, to honor and obey.
Yes.
And so, you know, and so it's going to definitely be tougher as they get older, but it doesn't mean that you can't intervene with them. And there are wonderful resources available. The Families Managing Media is an example of a resource for parents for kids of absolutely any age. There's a marvelous book by Victoria Dunkley, which is on the reading list that all participants are going to get. And it's, what is that called? It's called Reset Your Child's Brain. Right? There are just great resources that are available to parents, because as a parent of a 15-year-old and you're in despair, you don't want to give up, but you're going to need support. And to think you're going to manage a kid who maybe is threatening you physically when you try to take the computer away, and therefore you're pretty scared of what will happen, or that your kid is threatening suicide, you absolutely don't want to be doing this alone. You want to be doing this with some good support. And there are multiple ways to get support. If you're living in a larger metropolitan area, there probably are, by this time in our century, there probably are some therapists who are now specializing in internet and video game addiction. So absolutely seek them out. But if you're someplace where there is no such person who, a therapist who's got the expertise, then you can turn to parent coaches. And there are several parent coaches that I'm aware of. Kim McDaniel and Chris Mulligan are down in LA. Parent coach professionals are out of Oregon, but they work with people all around the country by phone or by video. And they can really make a big difference. And so if you're going to intervene with a violent, threatening 15-year-old, you want to be very well prepared. Be prepared to, you might even go down to the police station and say, this is the day I'm going to do my intervention. I'm expecting there could be some violence. Don't be surprised if I give you a call. We might have to have him transported to the hospital, where he or she would be kept under watch, and so forth. So you just have to have a plan if you're going to do a major intervention. But absolutely,
I just like to say too, on behalf of every child and teen out there that's watching this, is they often don't have the information needed to make good decisions. So we often as parents or teachers feel that, we need to be in this authoritative role where we're, making rules and all that. And yet they're sitting there kind of going, what's the problem? I don't get what they're all worried about. I get emails like that all the time, right? So I do a lot of work in schools. They're called Tech Talks, where I go into the classroom. I sit down, try to get them on the floor as best I get on the same level as the kids, right? And they're stunned by the things that I share with them. I show them a video showing what happens to blood pressure and pulse as the child starts gaming. I do all sorts of things to help them to better understand. And I think we sometimes forget, that they're a growing adult, right? And so it doesn't matter if they're in grade 1 or 5 or 12, they can benefit immensely from information. So having listened to this session, one of the first things that you should do as these group participants is you now have this information. You want to go out and give that information to everybody else. That's the first step. Not go out and say, oh, I got to make all these rules. And what was that 1 hour a day a week, a year, whatever. It's really going back to your clinic setting, your school setting, your home setting, having a conversation with your kids and making sure they understand that information, then try to work together to create, some balanced technology management rules or some tech reduction rules.
I'm so glad you brought that up, Cris, and the respecting the child in this process, because sometimes we can be having that conversation among adults and not remember that they can participate, that respecting where they are, no matter what age, is so important. And now I want to really go right to viewer questions, because I know we have a lot of viewer questions for you both. I'd like to bring Sam back on, and let's get going with those questions.
Okay, so we have a lot of great viewer questions to dive into here. I'm going to start with one for Cris. Hi, Cris. I am a K-5 public school art teacher. When I hear you talk about the red flags, I can think of a few children. How do we find out if the behaviors are related to screen use?
So I always, I have a tech talk that I give to teachers to do in the classroom, right? And it always starts with how much are you using, right? So I really advocate that in any setting, clinic, home, school, we really start with our tech screens, right? So when we're looking at problematic behavior and trying to determine whether it's due to screens or not, then let's see how much, right? So let's look at the duration, let's look at the content, let's look at the age of first use that that child merged into the screen world. And if the contents are really high, then there might be a probability that this is related. But it's not problematic behavior and screen use. It's not A equals B or A leads to B, right? If we think about problematic behavior, there's a lot of issues that are going on in the family. So if we have a family who's very tech-centric, likely the kids are being ignored or neglected to some degree, right? And maybe sleep, guidelines aren't being followed, and usage, screen usage guidelines aren't being followed. So it's never a child with the problem, right? It's these surrounding communities, right? It's what's going on in the classroom, what's going on at home, it's never. We often focus on the child and go, well, the child has problematic behavior, right? And, oh, let's pull out the screens and see if it gets better. But it's not that simple, right? So start with usage rates. And I write stuff on the board. Who's using, and little kids don't really know how much they're using, right? So I say, what do you do when you go home from school? What do you do before dinner? Do you eat dinner at the table or do you eat it in front of the screen? What do you do after dinner? What do you do before bed? Do you sneak a screen into your bedroom at night? Or who has screens in their bedroom? Who could take their tablet or their cell phone, or who has a big TV in their bedroom? You get a lot of information there, right? With the little hands going up. So as a teacher, you're probably stunned at the number of kids that actually have devices in their bedroom. So right away there, you're going, okay, sleep. We got to talk about sleep, right? So that's the way to kind of get started. And what I say to teachers is always, you want them to talk to you, right? So get down on their level and ask questions, instead of, you insert a little bit of information, you get more questions, you get a little more information. And by the end of, the day kind of thing, then you really have a much better idea.
Great. Now, this is directed towards both of you. A lot of our participants are asking, are there differences between the different types of screen use? Is there a certain type of screen or engagement with a screen that is worse than another? Or is it all just kind of, do we need to regulate it all in the same way?
Well, I can jump in. Let me jump in first, and that is that I do think, from the perspective of working with the adolescents and adults that we work with, they are using screens for television, which is more passive. They're using interactive screens for video games and in chat rooms and so forth, and often creating content themselves online. And they're using their phones sometimes for those same activities or sometimes for different activities. But from my perspective, they are all ultimately the same. They're having a very similar effect, no matter the size. Smartphones are, after all, very powerful computers. They just happen to be very small.
So to add to that, with kids in schools, we talk about defining or delineating between what is mindless content, which is entertainment-based content, and what is mindful content. Because as Hilarie said, most of what they're watching is mindless entertainment, right? Or engaging in with their phones, or, so I like for the kids to be able to kind of discern what is mindful and mindless. And so we really we talk about that for quite some time, right? So, mindful content would be anything that's growing the brain, that's, making you smarter, that's making you curious, where you might go ask your parents a question, right? So, nature shows and different things. And mindless content is pretty much everything else. So I like to stimulate kids in really understanding that their brains are actually shrinking when they use mindless content for very, very long periods, and that they're actually going to grow their brain when they're using mindful content, and to be able to discern the difference.
I also would like to add in, from our perspective, is advertising content, and to make sure that kids are aware that they're being marketed to, and that they're being, you know, we won't be getting into it in this webinar, but we have in the past, and we have a working group in the network that is working on studying persuasive design, and how are these games designed to keep kids on them, and how are the devices designed to keep kids on them. It's not our purpose today, but just something to keep in mind and investigate on the Network Resource Library, and take a look at our previous webinars.
And I guess I'd like to add that the content does definitely matter, but no matter what the content is, if the child is spending too much time in front of the screen, it means they're not spending time doing the rest of life that they need to be doing. And so, for instance, that adolescent that I started off describing was doing coding. You know, that's considered, certainly that was growing his brain in certain ways, but failing to grow his brain in so many other ways. And so it ultimately, if you think in terms of a healthy child's life in a pie chart of 24 hours, and you know, what is the slice of pie that's spent sleeping, and the slice of pie that's spent doing school, and the slice of pie that's spent socializing face to face, and the slice of pie getting chores done, and then how much time is left over when everything else has been taken care of. You want to make sure that that slice of pie is not too large and is not squeezing out all the other things that kids
So
need.
Hilarie, could you take a moment to tell us how that happens at the center? How does the center intervene with helping kids to get that, achieve that balance and get back into those other activities?
Well, when in our adolescent program, when they arrive, they are going to spend a minimum of 2 months, and sometimes quite a bit longer, without access to any screens whatsoever. And during that time, they're going to go through withdrawal, which is experienced as boredom, experienced as frustration, irritation, restlessness, difficulty concentrating, difficulty sleeping. But they get over that in about a month. You know, they get through that in a month, and then they're much more relaxed and able to fully engage in the program. If it's not the summertime, if it's school time, then they are doing school. And that is often a struggle for them because they've been refusing to do school. And so sometimes it takes quite a while for them to be willing to re-engage with school. They're gardening, they're playing basketball, they're having a fitness class, they're learning to cook, they're cleaning up, they're doing chores, and they're spending time, free time, with music, with art. The property is out in nature in a very beautiful setting, so they are encouraged to be outdoors as much as we can get them outdoors. They can play chess, for instance, but the chess set is an outdoor chess set. You know, one of those really large chess sets. So that's what we're doing with them. It's also what we're doing with the adults. With the adolescents, if they reach a point in their development and their treatment success where we feel that they can start re-engaging with computer technology, then we'll let them start doing some of their schoolwork online. But that is very carefully monitored and limited. With the adults, the same kind of program where they're outdoors, they're connecting to nature, they're doing fitness, they're eating well, learning to cook, doing chores, developing healthier habits while they're away from screens. And then if they go into our transition program, now they are living together in groups of just up to 4. They're getting jobs, and they're using the computers for a limited time, monitored computers in our computer lab. So they're just starting to live life as normal young adults. But it takes them a long time to develop those other interests that, because now they have this huge void because they've given up their screen time, and they really have to learn how to enjoy life and find interesting things to do so that it's not difficult for them. But that takes time.
Thank you. Thank you for that explanation of what happens at the center. So Sam, do we have other viewer questions?
Yes, we do. This one, thank you, Andrew, for this great question. Andrew says, once children played for 2 hours after school every day, plus many hours during the weekend, isn't part of the problem that this part of childhood no longer exists?
So I just had a little bit of trouble understanding or hearing you, Sam. There's this a little garbling, but from what I heard from the question, and just verified that I heard that correctly, is that Andrew's asking if they're gaming or playing, you know, they're on screens for a couple hours after school every day and then all weekend, that this other side of play doesn't exist anymore, like.
I think what Andrew's trying to get at is the fact that many children don't have this access to this outside time playing on the playground unsupervised, for example, or they're participating in so many activities that their childhood is kind of optimized instead of just having this freedom to explore and play.
So play is very different today than it was when I was growing up. Parents have a lot of safety concerns, which prohibits them from accessing outdoors. One of my 10 steps is actually to have a discussion around safety as a family where parents and child are actually talking, or school, teachers are talking about safety, because I've watched playgrounds diminish to they're either dilapidated or infantile, they're not challenging for kids. I've watched recess diminish. I've watched kids who used to spend 10% of their day outside now spend maybe 1% of their day outside, moving from a building to a car, right? So it has really changed. And I am a huge advocate I have a blog called Moving to Learn, that we really need to get kids outside and moving. And so we have to look at the barriers and the limitations to getting them outside. If it is parental fear, then address that. Talk to, partners need to talk to each other. Is it reasonable, that they're 12 and they're not allowed to go outside after school? I never tell a parent that they should be less permissive with their child. Parents, I honor parents and their, their concerns about their child, but if they're limiting that child's development, that child's socialization, that child's building of a good cognitive brain, then by keeping them inside, really question, yourself and your beliefs, because if we're stopping the development of our child because of our own fear and our own anxiety as a parent, then maybe we should address our own fear and our own anxiety, right? And not do the easy thing, which is, I'll just keep them home. I've worked with young adults who are at home in the basement gaming and doing porn and whatever, and the parents don't see an issue with that, because the parent would say to me, well, at least they're safe and I know where they are, right? So this is not a future for these kids. This is not a sustainable way to raise a child, right? It's to just keep them inside.
Yeah. Thank you, Cris. I want to jump in and just say that we're a little bit past our hour here, so I want to say goodbye to anyone who has to log off. And Cris and Hilarie have graciously agreed to stay on another 15 minutes with us to answer additional viewer questions if we have them. I just want to also remind people our next webinar will be March 4th, 3:30 p.m. Eastern Time with Susan Lin and Josh Golan. Stay tuned for more information in your follow-up email, and that the resources will be on the website from this webinar. And we're so appreciative for the feedback. You also receive a really quick survey after this. We really appreciate the feedback about how much you're enjoying the webinars and what other topics you'd like to see us offer. Okay, Sam, let's go back to some questions.
Thanks, Jean. This is a question from Daisy. She asks, my question is for all the panelists. What is the best way to talk about this topic with parents? I am an early intervention specialist, newborn to 3 years old, and I can see firsthand how much and how early parents expose children to screens. How do I bring this up to parents in an effective way that leads to change as opposed to resistance? I find that I've brought this up to some of my parents in the past, but the information alone does not seem to elicit change for the family.
Cris, I think this is yours.
So what I start with is I start with some observations. You know, first give information, right, about screen overuse and how that's connected to problematic behaviors and development. So I'm understanding from the question that the person's already done that, right? So you've given them some information and nothing's happened. So then I look at their development, right? And I have a developmental scale that I often provide to parents. And it shows where they should be at with various fine motor, gross motor, speech, cognition, social, toileting, it depends on how young the child is, right? So, and then I say delicately, your child is, I've observed your child and they appear to be delayed in these areas. So what I'd like to talk to you about is like how much screens are using. Again, we want to eliminate that, right? As a causal factor. The child actually might issues, developmental issues related to some other thing, right? So, and try to help parents to be aware that what really builds a strong foundation for a child is those movement, touch, connection, nature. You guys can use my little triangle. I often give that on a card to parents, and I explain that, and then I talk about, I move right into how much of those things are they getting? Do you? What does your child do after school? And what do they do before dinner, after dinner? Do you guys eat dinner together? So it's trying to delicately move into helping the parents to see that their whole life has become very teens or tech-centric, and that it would be helpful for their child if they moved into a more movement-based, outdoor-based, touch and human connection centric family. I start with simple things with, the most common thing kids say to me that they want is they want board game night with their family, right? This is something that's just super, kids love games and they love their parents to play games with them. And so I say, maybe could you carve out one night a week where the family makes a commitment to have board game night? And, it starts simple, because it's too overwhelming for a parent to kind of look at their whole lives and kind of go, well, we have to change everything, right? Start with one thing, dinner together.
Thank you, Cris. I think also with the parents of the very young children, we have parent educators in the network, so stay tuned and check out the resource library. Some of the approaches are very different, and approaching parents from what we call the appreciative inquiry method, where you can ask them, what are your values and what did you want out of family life? And then backing into the screen solutions from there, and not making it, let's say, a top down, here's what I'm recommending, but what do you think you would be liking to have your family life look like? Great, Sam, can we go to the next question?
Yes, absolutely. Here's a question from Steve. Sherry Turkle, author of Reclaiming Conversation, expounds on the issue of diminishing empathy in young people as a result of their use of technology. If any of you believe that this is a proven problem, would you have any suggestions on methods to counter this?
Well,
Would you like to comment on empathy?
Yeah, I would like to just comment that I think this is, the earlier the intervention, the better. And so Cris may have something to say about this as well. I do see a really strong lack of empathy in so many of the young, the teenagers and adults that I work with. And so one of the things that we've now incorporated into our program are animals. And that the animals need to be cared for, and the animals need, so for instance, we have a place called Rise Up Ranch, and the adults all arrive there. That's the first place they arrive when they come. And so they spend a month learning how to take care of those animals. We have goats and horses and cats and a dog. And I really, for this older population, I think it is one of the best ways, and actually probably for a younger population as well, one of the best ways to help them develop more empathy than they have. But it is a big problem. And so, Cris, I am curious what your suggestions are for the younger children.
So content of media is key in this area. And if we think about the amount of violent content kids are exposed to, and by violence, what I mean is that people are harming each other. Very young children don't understand that. They don't have the cognitive ability to really make sense of why everyone's killing each other, right? And so they're far more vulnerable, especially 0 to 8, you know, they're far more vulnerable to violent content. And so if we're looking at wanting to enhance empathy, then, and you are what you watch, then we really have to start monitoring what it is kids are watching, right? And so what we want to look for with content is where people aren't killing each other and they're not hurting each other. And even cartoons are really violent. A lot of the young kids are watching these YouTube cartoons like Angry Birds. I mean, just look at the title, right? But they're hurting each other. And so you turn that off, and then what does the child do? Well, they go kick their sister or whatever. So early intervention for enhancing empathy is to respect the durations that the American Academy of Pediatrics is saying, the guidelines for duration, but also expose them to more pro-social content, right? So instead of antisocial, more pro-social. It's really important.
Great. We have about 5 more.
Okay, let me just make one more comment.
Yes.
Which is that for the adults who come into our program, we give something called the MCMI, and it is a test that is particularly good at picking up on personality disorders. And many of our guys who are coming in show traits, not usually a full-blown personality disorder, but traits of antisocial personality disorder. And it is for the very reason that we're talking about here, which is their exposure to totally inappropriate content, as well as their lack of face-to-face interaction, so that they can feel much more connection with and caring for another human being. The online mediated social connections just don't cut it.
And to take that into brain development, think of that little, 3 to 5 year old, and there is this really rapid pruning and proliferation process that's happening in the brain. And the brain is literally if they're watching antisocial content, then the pro-social parts of the brain are getting snipped, right? We're getting pruning to those areas because we're not using them, right? And we're getting proliferation of the antisocial neurons, lots of growth around the areas of the brain that are connected to reactivity and to violence. So that it's very easy, once you understand brain development, to understand why we're seeing those problematic behaviors following excessive use of anti-violent or violent content.
Right.
Thank you both. We have about 3 minutes left. Sam, do we have another urgent question?
We do. This question is from Teresa. She says, many of my clients are bullied if they do not have a smartphone at school. Do the panelists have any ideas how to address this issue with schools? And we have a similar question from Naja as well. She says, in the case of kids who are very social, given that gaming and device use is the new play, no one wants to be the kid who doesn't play or know how to in the group. So how do we address that?
I'm going to mention first and then go to our panelists for their input on it, that we, in the Screen Time Action Network, we have working groups. So if you go to the member tab on screentimenetwork.org, you'll see the Screens in Schools working group, and this is one of the issues that that group is taking up. And they're working on templates and actions that you can use to go to your school and to help with the school environment, social environment around devices. Cris, Hilarie.
Well, one thing I would like to recount is the story of a 16-year-old who came to our adolescent program, and when he left and went back home and went to school, he has not been, he uses tech in a very moderate way, but he doesn't game anymore. And he's a high schooler, and he's quite proud of himself and really talks to the other kids, with pride that he's given up gaming, and he knows it's not good for him, and he really wants to kind of advocate for kids to be less involved with tech. So I think that can start early if parents are willing to really help kids feel good about themselves and the fact that they are not playing Grand Theft Auto. Maybe they're not playing any video games, and they don't have a smartphone. They just have, maybe they don't have a phone, or they only have a dumb phone. That I think it can be framed with children in a way that they can accept it as cool to be a little bit of an outsider, but in a cool way.
Great. Cris, any final thoughts?
Yeah, and that's where we want to go. Is Hilarie, I want to set a trend where it is cool to be unplugged, right? That's what I see as we want to move toward that, right? So if parents keep caving to their kids saying, well, everybody has it, we're never going to get there, right? And I just really push too that we give the kids the adequate information. So if a teacher, say, is seeing that bullying going on in the classroom because one kid doesn't have a cell phone, open that up for discussion, provide, accurate, adequate information to make the ones who are doing the bullying kind of think, well, geez, actually maybe I should be what this other kid's doing, which is not using as much, right?
Great. Well, I want to thank both of our presenters today, Dr. Hilarie Cash, Cris Rowan. Thank you so much for being with us. This is a really important conversation that I know could go on, and that we're fascinated, but we're also so appreciative that you're bringing us the solutions today and that you've been with us for this hour and 15 minutes. Thank you both. Thanks everybody for attending. Answer that survey, and we're happy to be bringing you more of these webinars as the network grows. Thanks. Bye, everyone.